All right, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Okay, so let's get right into this video because I've got quite a lot I want to cover. So controversial individual, Erik Prince, who was the founder of Blackwater, a private military contractor here in the United States, made some series of controversial statements, of which he said that Africa needs to be recolonized by the West. A statement that he reaffirms again when asked, are you saying that we need to go in and recolonize Africa? And he said, yes, we need to go ahead and take it because they don't know how to govern themselves. So I want to discuss this much further. But before I do, I want you to take a listen to what he said, and I'll be right back.
All this talk of illegal migration in Europe, in the United States, it ultimately comes down to a contest of what is governance. Who is governed? Which countries are governed well? And if so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, then it's time for us to just put the imperial hat back on to say, we're going to govern those countries if you're incapable of governing yourselves, because enough is enough. We're done being invaded.
Because our own national security risk is at stake.
Exactly.
National security interests are at stake.
You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves and benefiting their citizens because the governments there are all about looting and pillaging and lining their pockets and going shopping in Paris instead of actually making their country better.
People on the left are going to watch this. They're going to say, wait a minute, Erik Prince is talking about being a colonialist again.
Absolutely. Yes. Enough. Because if you go to these countries and you see how they suffer under absolutely corrupt, made-up governments that are just criminal syndicates, the people of Africa, the people of Latin America, a lot of them deserve better. Now, some countries are really getting it together. Look at what El Salvador did. Bukele, murder capital of Latin America, he said, no more. Now El Salvador is safer than Prince William County.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Because the point that I want to highlight there is that he reaffirms and he says, yes, I am talking about let's be a colonialist again. Let's go ahead and colonize Africa, recolonize Africa again. He says it with such vigor, boldness. And I want to discuss this because, you would think that it'll be crazy for anyone to ever talk about recolonizing Africa, a process that has since been known as a demonic act by Europe mostly. And later on, the West has also exploited Africa. You would think that we live in a society today where no one should ever glamorize a process in the past that's destabilized a continent and have continued to rob a continent. It's essentially the same thing with slavery, because you wouldn't expect anyone to glamorize slavery, because that's essentially the same thing. That Africa the continent isn't doing anything. They can't govern themselves. So let's go ahead and help them out. It's essentially the same thing. If someone said today, let's go ahead and re-enslave Black people, because Black people cannot seem to get it right. They can't seem to govern themselves. You wouldn't expect anyone to say such a thing, because we all know that slavery was evil, was an act that was perpetuated on Black people, an evil act that you would expect, especially people of his lineage, white folks, to be ashamed of and never, ever talk about that in a glamorous thing. But no, you have a person like this, a controversial figure, a mercenary who was part of a mercenary group, say this about a continent. So we're going to discuss this in detail because I need you to understand what's going on here. And I need you to understand why a racist person like him would make a statement boldly in 2024, knowing fully well that that type of talk should be condemned and should not be welcomed. You know why? Because he's talking to people who share the same type of thinking. So let's address this bits by bits, because I want to dissect a lot of the false points that he makes there. So the first point, in terms of Africa isn't doing anything, that Africans aren't able to govern themselves. Now, let me break that down. prior to a process known as the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885, Africans in Africa were governing themselves just fine. As a matter of fact, of all the continents and regions all over the world, Africa seemed to be able to live among themselves, survive, no problem. They didn't bother anyone. They had enough food and resources to cater for themselves. And this is even after they had been ravaged during slavery. Because understand that in 1884, Africa had been destabilized because of a lot of the slavery act that many of his people went in there, put a gun in a lot of the chief's head, and forced them to sell a lot of their people into slavery. Now, all the way into 1884, his people, the Europeans, whose economy at the time was going through a downward spiral, and in an attempt of not really fighting each other because they were at odds against each other, they pointed the gun to Africa, and they came to Berlin in Germany, and they had a series of months discussion how they should not fight each other, but let's take the fight to these Africans who we took their people and enslaved them, because at this point slavery had ended in most part of the world. And this is a process known as the Berlin Conference, which lasted from 1884 all the way to 1885. And they came into Africa to conquer Africa in a process that we all know today as colonization, a thing that has really destabilized a lot of African countries in Africa. Many countries in Africa today are still suffering the effect of colonialism, even while many countries have gained their independence, or most countries have. It's just on paper. Because the so-called independence that a lot of the African countries got in the 60s is all on paper. While these countries who colonized those regions and those countries have continuously exploited the resources of Africa for years and up on today. His country, the United States, benefits and is one of those perpetuators of colonialism in Africa. There are three major countries in the Western Europe that have exploited and continue to exploit Africa today. These three are the United States, England, and France. These have been the biggest exploiters of Africa. And he comes from a country like, so he knows. So we'll talk about that later on because I want to dissect it. So that's how they came into Africa, a process known as scramble for Africa, to carve Africa out like a pie and steal for Africa from its resources. Now, let's talk about, did Africa just let them do this? Did Africa just say, you know what? Just go ahead and exploit my resources. No big deal, because when you hear a guy like him talk, all these leaders just, they go to Paris and they just live off lavishly while their people are in dire straits. And he creates this narrative that that's what Africa is. And that is the kind of thinking that a lot of people have. But what he doesn't say, because he's a mercenary who has been involved in the assassination of African leaders who have dared to challenge the West and Europe from exploiting their land. Let's talk about these African leaders, because that's the part that he doesn't want to talk about. And he knows this because he created and founded a mercenary military contract operation, which he was an ex-Navy SEAL operator. So he's been involved. And I told you about the fact that this individual is being shrouded in controversies. We'll talk about his controversies later on. But let's talk about the African leaders over the years who have dared to push back at the West and Europe from exploiting their land. Let's talk about the likes of Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of Congo, who loved his people and loved his country and wanted to ensure the growth and development of his country, decided to nationalize the resources in his country, decided to privatize a lot of the resources in the country so that way it benefits the Congolese people. But the likes of Belgium, who they got their independence from, said, nah, we can't have this. Because essentially what he was talking about, the policies he was putting in place, was going to cut off these European countries from exploiting the resources of the Congolese people. And so they knew that that was going to kill the exploitation of in Africa, in Congo. They decided to connive with the United States, along with the CIA and propaganda, which gathered or recruited some misplaced Congolese. They used some misplaced Congolese to carry out a coup against him in 1961. They arrested him, tortured him, and eventually he was killed. That's Patrice Lumumba, an African head of state who was trying to do something for his own people. No, they couldn't have that. And then you have Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, another person who was echoing what was going on in Congo, someone who wanted to bring, to socialize and build his economy, to revitalize his country's economy. He wanted to privatize a lot of their resources also. Same thing, nationalize a lot of what they had. They said no, because the likes of France and many European countries needed the uranium, needed the resources. And so these types of talk was going to cut them off. And they said, we can't have that. They ousted him out in a coup. That's how they took him out. And they had another one, Muammar Gaddafi from Libya. And we all know what happened with Muammar Gaddafi, an African leader who was loved by his people, who was trying to unify Africa. In Libya, you could go to school for free in Libya. Women had high prominent positions in Libya. In this country, women are still subject to oppression in this country. But in Libya, women had, such respect. In his own military camp, Muammar Gaddafi had women soldiers that served in his own armed forces. And so they didn't like his plan for Africa because he was trying to create a United States of Africa where Africa was going to be self-sustaining. Africa had gold. He wanted gold to be the backed reserve for Africa's currency. He wanted to create an African currency that most African currencies were going to benefit off. Essentially, he was going to kick out the West and Europe. They didn't like that. They're like, no, we can't have that. They created a propaganda around him, ousted him out with the help of using their own people to take him out. Same thing with Sylvanus Olympio of Togo, same thing. So you can go on and on and on with African leaders who have stepped up, right, to challenge the West and say, hey, you can't keep exploiting our land. I know we got our independence, but you can't keep putting us in abject poverty. We need to look at it for our own people. And it's like, no. We can't have that, because essentially what that would mean is to cut the West off of exploitation, and they need Africa to be exploited so they can build their own countries. They need Africa's resources to be sold at pennies on the dollar, because essentially how capitalism works. Okay, if just in case you were wondering how capitalism, a system that's known in the United States, the economic system in the United States is built on capitalism. Essentially, you got to buy it cheap and sell it for a high price. That's how you get a huge margin. Right? That's how that works. So Africa is that land that they exploit and get their resources cheap so they can sell it at high price in the market. That's how they enrich themselves. So you have the guys like him who has been involved in a lot of destabilization. So let's talk about his resume for a second, because he's a controversial figure, a person who his Blackwater company has also been shrouded in a lot of controversies, especially in Iraq. In 2007, he was in a huge controversy where 17 Iraqis were killed at the hands of his mercenary group and many things like that. So he's been used to do a lot of these types of corrupt things. Now, how did they do this? How did they get Africa to bend to their will? How did they get Africa to bend the knees? Because a lot of you might be asking, okay, hold on a second, which is essentially what many people don't understand. Many people look at it like, oh, our leaders are corrupt. And you echo the same racist sentiments that you have people like these guys echo. Our leaders are corrupt. Our leaders are corrupt. Our leaders don't want to build our countries. When I've just told you, many leaders in Africa who have dared, and the ones I gave you are just a few of them, right? A few. There are many others who have been assassinated, who have been threatened, who have been destabilized at the hands of the West, just so they can go in and steal their uranium, steal their resources, steal their gold, steal their oil, steal their natural resources at their own benefit. Okay. Now, how do they do it? How does the West and Europe do this thing? I want you guys to read a book by a man named John Perkins, who was an author of a very fascinating book called The Confession of an Economic Hitman. And what he does in his book, which I think is fascinating, you can go read, you can buy the book on Amazon, And I encourage everyone to read it because you're going to understand how they do it. You're going to understand why Africa needed to be poor and what they've done to ensure that Africa is in abject poverty for the survival of both the West and Europe. And he talks about this, he breaks it down in 3 stages, essentially. John Perkins does. And he says that the first stage is where they go in and indebt Africa. They find an African country with infrastructural problems that started as a result of when a lot of these colonizers left. They destroyed a lot of the infrastructures there. They left the place a little desolate. So they find those countries and they indebt them with debts, with the false illusion of really helping them to build their infrastructure. Kind of like what we're seeing right now today with China and a lot of those loans that they get. So it's an economic debt. They indebt those countries with that, knowing fully well those countries are not going to be able to pay this back. And then they force them to refinance on a higher interest rate. So the way they do that is because they know that that's going to cause them to default and also not be able to ever pay back this loan. So the first stage is they said in what's called an economic hitman, a person who comes in a suit, looks like a professional person dressed in a suit and tie, but is a vicious hitman that goes and talks to the leaders and the head of states and tells them, hey, you're not able to pay this debt back. So here's what we want in return. We need you to sell your uranium to us at pennies on the dollars as a way of paying back this loan. We need you to sell your oil for us at basically a fraction of what you would normally sell it in the global market. So essentially, that's how they rob Africa. Now, that is the first stage. If you have any head of state who dared to say no, hell no, go to hell with this, then they go into a second stage where they send what's called a jackal. A jackal is essentially an assassin, a person who is a mercenary, the type of guy this guy was, an ex-military operative who goes in and they use that person to assassinate these presidents. So a lot of the ones that I've just told you about who've been assassinated in the past have fallen into the hands of a jackal who goes in and assassinate them, either a long sniper rifle shot that takes them out, or they plan a coup to assassinate them. Either way, it's at the hand of a jackal who works with a lot of people who they have, who have a misplaced understanding of what's going on. They take that person out. Now, if these two acts don't work, then there's a third phase of it, which is a military intervention. That is the final. So by the time you find a military invasion of a country, it's because the first two went south. That is a fascinating book you need to go read because it'll help you understand the strategy that the West and Europe uses to keep places like Africa on its knees. So the question now you ask is, what is Africa supposed to do? Because when you hear a guy like him talk and snuff their noses, knowing fully well he knows, because he's been part of the type of operation, he knows the corruption that goes on behind closed doors. He knows the types of deals, he knows the type of threats that African leaders are up underneath. He knows that, but he will never say that. He will never, because he's talking to a base. He's pushing the same narrative out there, the same narrative that I need you Africans to stop talking about, because a lot of you echo the same narrative. Oh, why our country is so poor? Why is African leaders so corrupt? Yes, there are some corrupt leaders, but I guarantee you that those corrupt leaders who are self-corrupt pales in comparison to those who have been corrupted and who are under a gun and a threat, whose their families are under a gun and a threat, whose countries are under a gun and a threat at the hands of these evil European and Western countries who need to exploit those resources for their own gain. Okay, so now that we understand that when you hear a guy like him talk, it's just coming out of a racist sentiment. Because when he talks about Africa and he talks about the immigration into this country, because essentially what he's saying is that Africans are not able to govern, so they come to our country, right? They come to our country and we need to go ahead and help them out, because if they were able to govern themselves, they won't come to our country. What again, he doesn't say, because either is ignorant or of course he is being deceptive and he is just putting out disinformation out there, is when you look at the migration to the United States or the West, you wouldn't even find any African countries as the top migrants to the United States. What you're looking at right now, especially here in the United States, the largest migrants in this country from other countries, you won't find any African country in the top 20. Pew Research Center has done a study on this. You find a lot of articles. It's a known fact. The biggest migrants to this country from other countries, from Mexico, China, India, the Vietnamese, or the biggest Philippines, you won't find any African country in any of this. But you will find them, people like this that will make the assertion that Africans just want to come to our country when Africans don't even represent the top 20 countries when people are migrating from to the likes of the United States. And you'll find the same representation in any part of Europe. But they will single out Africa as a place that everyone is just leaving. Now, let's talk about why Africa, though. Why would a person like this have the gall in 2024 make such statement, knowing fully well that such statement needs to be condemned, because what that is shrouded in racism, right? Shrouded in hate, shrouded in anything you want to think about. That's what that shrouds in. Because as I mentioned earlier on, no one would ever say today, we need to go ahead and enslave black people. Because black people can, you wouldn't expect that, even though I know some people think it, and I know that these conversations go on in private settings, but on platforms and on public settings, you wouldn't expect anyone, especially anyone in his position, to ever say such thing, right? Which is why it's bizarre and it's kind of shocking when he says stuff like this, that let's go ahead and recolonize Africa. Now, why would he say such thing? It's because he thinks Africa is the lower fruit to beat on. He thinks Africa is weak, and Africa is just a continent that is both economically and politically weak. So let's just go ahead and beat on Africa. Okay, so let's talk about that, because I think that that's another part that I want to focus on, because the likes of him, you know, talking about recolonizing Africa. Let me tell him right now, and tell anyone that thinks about that, it's never going to happen. You will never recolonize Africa. It is never going to happen again. The way you went into Africa in 1884, 1885 is never going to happen again. Let me tell you, because the Africa today is not the Africa in 1884. See, 1884, Africa didn't have friends. Africa was minding its own business. Africa was just by itself. Africa essentially was self-sustaining continent, who was governing itself quite well. Africa was governing itself. Africa didn't need anyone. Everyone else needed Africa, apparently. So the only people that couldn't govern themselves are people like him, people from his own background, white folks. They couldn't govern themselves. With all the monies they made from slave labor, with all the exploitation of slaves in the early 1600s all the way to the 1800s, their countries were falling apart economically. So they needed Africa to survive. Apparently, they couldn't govern themselves. Even today, they still can't, because they still need Africa to help them, because a lot of the resources, most of the resources they don't have it in their land. Because Africa today has more friends and allies than when they did in 1884. Africa today has more allies than even the West and Europe put together. You see, back in 1884, Africa was on its own, chilling. No one, it wasn't bothering anybody, wasn't causing anybody any problem. They were just hanging out themselves, doing whatever. Africa today is a source of life for most European countries, if not all of them, and also many other Asian countries. Africa is the center of life for a lot of them. So with that also comes a lot of friends. So Africa today has a lot of friends, because there's a lot of people who depend on their survival because of Africa. So that whole idea of going to invade Africa, the way they did European countries, it's not going to happen again. He knows it. Most countries in Africa have more friends than even US and Europe. He knows that the United States has more enemies in the world than friends. He knows that. Nigeria alone probably has a lot more friends than the United States. If the United States ever tries to attack Nigeria, I guarantee you, Nigeria has friends that will stand up for her to fight against anyone, because they all have interest. They all have an economic interest because of the resources that a lot of them depend on Nigeria for, if it came down to it. Now, of course, Africa should be able to fight its own battles. Africa should be able to fight its own wars, but most wars aren't fought today. Silo. So when you have people like this talk as though they're smart, if you're that smart, you wouldn't need to steal from somebody else to build your own land. See, that's how I respect somebody. See, I don't respect people like him. You know, if you want me to respect you, you take what is in your land, take the lemons in your land and make lemonade. Don't go steal my lemons to make your lemonade. Don't take my oranges to make your orange juice. If you were that smart, you would find the resource in your country and then you would develop that without having to steal from somebody else. But no, you don't get to steal from somebody else and then call yourself smart. That's not going to work. You're not smart. Equally, I can't go and cheat on an exam, on a test, and pass and call myself smart. Who's going to do that today? Which one of you will cheat on an exam or cheat on a test and say and call yourself smart, knowing fully well you cheated to pass? That's not smart. But you have white males like this who know fully well that they can't survive without Africa, you know, and now beat on Africa. It's essentially, you know, let me go ahead and take everything you got. The same sentiment you find here in this country. You know, when after slavery ended with black people in this country, let's deny you housing rights. Let's deny you loan rights, the ability for you to get business loan. Let's deny you education. Let's deny you a lot of the things. But then let's go ahead and then accuse you of not being able to pull yourself off by your bootstrap. That's the same sentiment you find from people that think like him against us. Is they tie our hands behind our back and they tell us, why can't we build ourselves when they are the cause of our destabilization? They're the cause of the poverty. They can't build their own country without going to exploit from other countries. But then they have the audacity to come in 2024 and say, Africa can't govern itself. So let's go ahead and recolonize Africa. A very offensive statement that everyone should be outraged by. I'm going to tell you Africans or black people in the world, do not, please, you need to stop echoing the racist sentiments of racist people like this. When you say stuff like Africa needs to pull itself off, you sound as ignorant and racist and as a bigot like this person when you say things because you show that you lack understanding. You show that you lack any intelligent reasoning. Because I've just demonstrated for you in the past leaders and countries who have tried to pull themselves up. What are they supposed to do when you have such threats? When you have such, sanctions, when you have such bullying by these Western and European countries against countries like that? What are they supposed to do? So I need you to stop toting and echoing the same sentiments of racist people like these guys who destroy countries and then ask, how are you not able to build yourself up? You can't throw stones in glass houses and then hide your hand and say, I didn't do it. Those are usually the worst ones in society. So we need to really call people like this out. Because I, for one, I'm disgusted at what he said. I have no respect for people like him. I have no respect for anyone that thinks like him. And we shouldn't either. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Please like the video, share the content, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all next time.
Det finns ingen annan där som kan stå här by my side, oh why. Sättet du rör på det får mig att dö för det, baby. För de här yardis, de vill ju bara dra ner oss. Men du är fett och vanlig. Och det jag lägger av min tid, jag vill ha det. Du får mig känna safety. Jag kan nog leda, baby.